Breathing is almost obviously fundamental to life. It only takes about 3 minutes without oxygen, then we're pretty much gone. They could, of course, go longer if they've trained themselves or if they're revived after perhaps 10 minutes, depending on conditions. But basically 3 minutes, and life ends. And what takes the brunt of the lack of oxygen is the nervous system, particularly the brain. Having said that, enough can't be said for finding proper breathing, both in daily life as well as in the yoga practice. So I can also imagine some ancient yogis in the distant past being in some kind of situation where they observe somebody who has not been able to breathe and probably dies. And as a result, there's this sort of intimate connection between breath and life force. And if we look at breath, what comes in with that breath is simply oxygen. Remember, molecules. Sometimes we just say the word oxygen and we don't really connect to what that specifically means, but basically, 2 molecules of oxygen joined together. We're already getting really subtle. And so what is behind that oxygen doing what it does and how it feeds our body and nourishes our tissues is, in a sense, prana, is life force. So oxygen and prana are not the same thing, but on the continuum, oxygen is just slightly more gross than the very subtle prana. So let's look at the actual act of breathing and what happens. Now, the main muscle of respiration is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is unlike any other muscle in that one is its shape, and 2, its thickness. It's actually only about 1/8 of an inch thick, extremely thin. The other aspect that's interesting about it is that it doesn't attach from one bone to another bone and then move those 2 bones in relationship to one another. Instead, the diaphragm attaches onto itself. Let me show you. The diaphragm is circular in nature, and it runs and attaches onto the xiphoid process here at the bottom of the sternum, along the line of the rib cage, back here to these floating ribs, back onto the spine, around to these floating ribs, and then back up the front of the rib cage. So the first attachment is quite circular. And then the fibers move upward from here and create a dome shape up here inside the rib cage. It's almost like opening an umbrella underneath the rib cage. And as you'll see, we have an image here that shows the rib cage, the diaphragm. You'll see it through the rib cage there, and then the abdominal muscles beneath that. So from this circular attachment up until the top of the dome, and the top of the dome is called the central tendon. And so the fiber direction is upward until it attaches onto this common central tendon. And so when we breathe, the top of the diaphragm, that central tendon, actually drops down. Now, sitting on top of the diaphragm is the heart and the lungs. And of course, the heart and the lungs are surrounded by connective tissue. And of course, the diaphragm itself, being tendinous in nature in that area, is also connective tissue. And so the connective tissue of the diaphragm actually is connected to the connective tissue that's around the lungs. So when that diaphragm drops, it actually pulls on those bags. And as a result of pulling on those bags, there's a negative pressure created inside your chest. And so the air outside is of a higher pressure, and so air is forced into your mouth or your nose, depending on how you like to breathe. It is also possible to change the direction of breath. And this is where we get this little overlap of functionality with Mula bandha and Uddiyana bandha. Mula bandha is defined as the root lock or valve. And Uddiyana bandha is the upward flying valve. And these are 2 concepts that are aligned with energy and therefore also connected to breath, because through the breath comes the energy. While looking at this entire structure, and again, if you look at the image on the screen, you'll see that basically what we create is a tissue container. The diaphragm above, the abdominal muscles around the sides and the front, and the pelvic floor muscles fill in this space underneath. And so if we change the shape of this container, it affects the way in which the diaphragm functions. So Imagine this for a moment. If we take a nice, full, deep inhalation in, our abdomen will naturally move outward as a result of the downward pressure from the diaphragm, pushing down on the abdominal contents, and then it follows the path of least resistance, which is out through the abdomen. At the same time that it's doing that, it's also putting pressure downward on the pelvic floor. And so the most gross way of engaging Mula Bandha is to contract the pelvic floor muscles. Now, I just want to mention that the pelvic floor muscles themselves are not Mula Bandha. They just stimulate the Mula Bandha. In the same way that Uddiyana Bandha, although we draw our abdomen completely in to make the Uddiyana Bandha, it's not the actual drawing in of the abdomen, it's what's stimulated by drawing the abdomen in. So, if we look at the intention of Mula Bandha, it is to prevent the downward movement of energy from it escaping out through our torso. And so if we contract our pelvic floor, when we breathe, that inhalation, the pressure from the diaphragm comes down, but it no longer goes down and out through the pelvic floor. If we also hold in our abdomen, then we once again change how pressure and force move from the diaphragm's inhalation. A very interesting thing happens here. When the abdomen is drawn in, or when you tighten your abdominal muscles, as the diaphragm contracts, because its fibers are upward, or basically vertical in nature, and it attaches to these ribs, the top of the diaphragm doesn't move now. Instead, the contraction of the diaphragm actually lifts the rib cage up. And so if you think of the intention of Uddiyana Bandha, it's to make the energy move upward. So on an inhalation with the navel drawn in, the breath ends up lifting right up into the chest and through the ribs, which is the exact idea of Uddiyana Bandha.